been so concerned about his Vulcan eyes, Doctor. You forgot about his Vulcan ears. Ahead, walk back to one, Mr. Sulu.
There's a moment in 1968 when NBC executives watched the unedited footage of what will become one of television's most iconic scenes. A white starship captain leans in and kisses his black communications officer. The room goes silent. Not because of what they're seeing, but because of what they know is about to happen when the American South sees it too. One of the men in that room quietly says they should cut it. Another says they can't. And in that impossible space between those two sentences, something in American culture shifts forever. But here's what almost nobody knows. The kiss that changed television history? It nearly didn't happen at all. And the reason has nothing to do with censors. Stop there for a second, because everything you think you know about Star Trek, the show that gave us cell phones, tablets, and Bluetooth earpieces decades before they existed, sits on top of a foundation of accidents, rebellions, studio fights, and decisions so strange they feel like fiction. This isn't a story about a TV show. This is a story about what happens when a canceled series refuses to die. When fans invent a new kind of power, when the future gets built by people who weren't supposed to win. And almost none of it went the way you were told. Here's where it gets to start to get strange. The very first fact that changes how you see the entire franchise. Star Trek was never supposed to be Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry pitched it to the networks as Wagon Train to the Stars, a Western in space, safe and familiar. That's what sold it. But what Roddenberry actually wanted to make was something far more dangerous, a Trojan horse. He wanted to smuggle social commentary past the censors by disguising it as alien planets and rubber heads. The network thought they were buying space cowboys. Roddenberry knew he was building a pulpit. And for 3 years, nobody in the executive suites seemed to notice they'd been tricked. But here's the part that should disturb you. It worked, because Roddenberry understood something deeply cynical about television in the 1960s. Censors wouldn't let you show an interracial kiss on Earth. They wouldn't let you criticize the Vietnam War directly. They wouldn't let you question authority, challenge racism, or explore moral ambiguity in contemporary settings. But put it on a spaceship? Suddenly, it's just entertainment. The mistake the censors made was believing the future was safer than the present. Roddenberry bet his career on the opposite. He was right. Now we arrive at the fact that most people get wrong, even the fans. You've been told that Star Trek was a ratings failure, canceled too soon, a misunderstood masterpiece. That's not quite true. The real story is weirder and more instructive. Star Trek's ratings were fine. Not great, not terrible. Middle of the pack. NBC didn't cancel it because nobody watched. They canceled it because the wrong people were watching. The show's audience skewed young, urban, educated, and female. In 1969, advertisers didn't care about those demographics. They wanted rural families. They wanted older viewers. They wanted consumers who bought soap and cars, not college students who questioned authority. Star Trek died because it was loved by people the system didn't value yet. But those people refused to let it go. And this is where the story turns into something unprecedented. Fans launched a letter-writing campaign so massive that NBC was literally buried in mail. We're talking nearly 1 million letters. The network had never seen anything like it. They brought the show back for a 3rd season just to stop the avalanche of paper. But here's the poison pill. They brought it back with no budget, a terrible time slot, and almost no support. It was a 3rd season designed to fail. And it did. Star Trek was canceled again in 1969, and this time it looked final. Except, the fans had learned something new. They had power. They just didn't have a name for it yet. 15 years before the word fandom entered the cultural lexicon the way we understand it now, Star Trek fans were inventing the playbook. They were organizing conventions, writing their own stories, building a community around a dead TV show. They kept it alive in the dark. And when the 1970s brought syndication, those reruns found millions of new believers. The show that failed on network TV became the most successful syndicated series in television history. The lesson? Sometimes the audience knows better than the industry, and sometimes they're willing to fight longer. Here's the next fact, and it's the one that reveals how much was riding on things nobody controlled. Spock, the character that became the emotional heart of the entire franchise, was almost cut from the show before it even aired. NBC hated him. They thought the pointed ears looked him demonic. There were focus groups, there were memos, there were executives who genuinely believed that American audiences, especially in religious markets, would reject a show with a devil-faced character on the bridge. They wanted Spock gone. Roddenberry refused, but he was a new showrunner with no leverage, so he compromised. He agreed to hide Spock in the background of promotional materials and downplay him in the marketing. The character that would eventually define Star Trek had to sneak onto the air. What saved Spock wasn't Roddenberry's stubbornness, it was the mail. Women specifically started writing to NBC in huge numbers, asking for more of the guy with the ears. Fan magazines picked it up. Leonard Nimoy's face started appearing on covers. By the middle of the first season, Spock had become the breakout star, and the network couldn't ignore it. The character they wanted to erase became the franchise's most iconic figure. But think about how fragile that was. If the audience had agreed with the executives, if those early fans hadn't written those letters, the entire emotional architecture of Star Trek collapses. One wrong focus group, and there is no Spock, no Data, no Seven of Nine, no entire lineage of characters built on the question, what does it mean to be human if you're not? Now we go deeper into the stuff that even dedicated fans miss. The Enterprise itself, the ship that became one of the most recognizable designs in science fiction, was built for $600. Not $600,000, $600. The original filming model was made of wood, paper, and plastic, assembled in a garage by a designer named Richard Dayton, who had almost no money and even less time. It looked cheap up close. The nacelles were made from bottle caps and flashlight parts, but shot from the right angle, lit carefully, and moved slowly against a star field. It looked like the future. That's not a fun trivia note. That's a masterclass in how limitations force creativity. The Enterprise became legendary, not despite its cheap construction, but because the builders understood that belief doesn't come from budget, it comes from commitment to the illusion. But here's where it gets darker. That model wasn't treated like the priceless artifact it would become. It was used, abused, repainted, damaged, and eventually lost. For decades, no one knew where the original Enterprise was. It turned up in a storage unit, rotting. By the time it was recovered and restored, whole sections had to be rebuilt from scratch. The ship that carried the dreams of millions was nearly thrown away like garbage. There's a metaphor in that. The things we build when we have nothing are often the things that outlive us, but only if someone remembers to protect them. Here's the fact that changes how you hear every line of dialogue in the original series. The show's famous intensity, the way Kirk pauses mid-sentence, the dramatic line readings, the stretched-out delivery, wasn't an acting choice. It was a technical necessity. William Shatner and the other actors were told to speak slowly and leave gaps because the episodes were running short. Star Trek was an expensive show to produce, and they kept coming in under time. Instead of writing more scenes or padding the scripts, the directors just told the actors to slow down. Every dramatic pause you thought was brilliant character work, a lot of it was just filling airtime. Shatner turned a technical problem into a signature style, and it became so iconic that people have been imitating it for 50 years. That's not luck. That's alchemy.
But it gets stranger. Some of the most famous episodes were written in literal days because scripts fell through or writers quit. The City on the Edge of Forever, widely considered the best episode of the series, was a nightmare behind the scenes. Harlan Ellison's original script was deemed too expensive and too dark. Roddenberry rewrote it. Ellison hated the changes and fought bitterly for decades over the credit. The episode that won Hugo and Nebula Awards, the one that made grown adults cry, was born out of a vicious creative battle where both sides believed the other was destroying it. You can feel that tension in the final product. It's part of why the episode works. The emotions weren't just on the page, they were in the room. Now let's talk about the kiss, the one everyone knows about, the one that's taught in film classes and civil rights discussions. Kirk and Uhura, 1968, the first interracial kiss on American television. Except that's not totally accurate, and the truth is more complicated and more interesting. There had been interracial kisses on TV before, but they were brief on British shows or involved characters whose race was ambiguous. Star Trek's kiss was the first sustained, romantic, nationally broadcast interracial kiss on a major American network. That distinction matters. But here's the fact that reframes the entire story. Nichelle Nichols and William Shatner weren't supposed to kiss. In the script, they were forced to kiss by alien mind control, which gave the network plausible deniability. The scene was designed to be just ambiguous enough to air. But Shatner and Nichols knew what they were really doing, and they sabotaged every take where their lips didn't actually touch. The director wanted alternate footage, safe versions where the kiss was implied or hidden by camera angles. Shatner deliberately ruined those takes. He crossed his eyes, he moved at the wrong time, he made sure the only usable footage was the real kiss. When the NBC reviewed the edits, they had no choice. The safe version was unusable. The kiss stayed in. It aired, and the South erupted exactly as the executives feared. Except for one detail no one predicted. Nichelle Nichols received more fan mail that week than any other in the show's run, and most of it was positive. The audience was ready. The network just didn't trust them. Here's the one that should unsettle you. The transporter, the device that became one of Star Trek's most iconic pieces of technology, wasn't invented because it was cool. It was invented because the show was broke. Roddenberry wanted scenes of the Enterprise landing on planets. He had models designed, he had shots planned, but landing a starship over and over again, week after week, was going to cost a fortune in effects work. The budget couldn't handle it, so the writers invented a way to skip it. A machine that beams people directly to the surface. Problem solved. Except they just accidentally created one of science fiction's most enduring ethical nightmares. Does the transporter kill you and build a copy? Is the person who arrives the same person who left? Are you dying every time you step on the pad? The show never answered that question because it was never asking it. The transporter was a budget trick that became a philosophical weapon. Future writers would use it to explore identity, consciousness, duplicates, and the nature of the self. But it started as, we can't afford to land the ship. That's the whole game. The constraints that seemed like creative death became the choices that made Star Trek timeless. If they'd had more money, the transporter might not exist. And without the transporter, you lose a dozen classic episodes and one of the most examined thought experiments in pop culture. Poverty built the future. We're almost at the end, but this next one might be the strangest of all. Star Trek created the concept of fan fiction as we know it today. Not science fiction in general, fan-written stories based on existing media. Before Star Trek, there were fan clubs and appreciation societies, but there wasn't an organized culture of fans writing and distributing their own stories using someone else's characters. That started with Star Trek fanzines in the early 1970s. Fans wrote their own episodes. They explored relationships the show wouldn't touch. They fixed endings they didn't like. They passed these stories around at conventions, through the mail, in photocopied booklets that were sold or traded in total legal gray areas. Some of the people who wrote those stories went on to become professional TV writers. Some of them ended up writing for Star Trek itself. And here's the deeply weird part. Gene Roddenberry knew about it and he allowed it. Other studios were sending cease and desist letters. Roddenberry let it grow. He understood that those fans were keeping the show alive in a way no marketing campaign ever could. They were building a mythology that was bigger than what he created.
He lost control of his creation, and he let it happen because he was smart enough to know that loss of control was actually expansion of power. The fans didn't take Star Trek from him, they made it immortal. And decades later, when studios realized fan engagement was the most valuable currency in entertainment, they were all trying to recreate what Star Trek's audience built by accident in the 1970s. Here's the last fact, and it's the one that closes the circle. When Star Trek finally returned in 1979 with the motion picture, it had been 10 years since the original series ended. The cast had aged, the culture had moved on, science fiction had gotten darker, grittier, more cynical. Star Wars had just redefined what a space movie could be. Everyone expected Star Trek to come back louder, faster, more action-heavy. Instead, Roddenberry and director Wise made a long, slow, meditative film about wonder, awe, and the cost of exploration. Critics hated it. Audiences were confused. The studio panicked, but the film made enough money to justify a sequel, and that sequel, The Wrath of Khan, became the template for every Star Trek film that followed. But here's what's easy to miss. The motion picture failed because it was exactly what Star Trek had always been: thoughtful, quiet, more interested in ideas than explosions. It didn't fail because it was bad. It failed because the audience had changed and they wanted something else. The lesson Star Trek learned was brutal. To survive, you have to become what the moment demands, even if it betrays what you were. And ever since, the franchise has been caught between two identities, the one that made it matter and the one that keeps it alive. That tension has never resolved. Every new series, every new film, every reboot is a fight between the Star Trek that smuggled philosophy past the censors and the Star Trek that needs to compete with superheroes and streaming wars. Some fans want the old version, some want it to evolve, and the franchise survives by refusing to choose, by being both at once, by letting different people see different things when they look at the same ship. Go back to that room in 1968, the executives watching The Kiss, the fear that it would end the show, the belief that audiences weren't ready. They were wrong, but they weren't stupid. They were reading the culture the way it had always been read. What they didn't see coming was that a TV show could change the culture instead of reflecting it, that a canceled series could refuse to die, that a future invented on a soundstage with no money and dying ratings could become more real than the present. Star Trek didn't predict the future. It convinced people the future was worth building. And the weirdest fact of all, it's still working.